I want to pick up some comments from a video that I made about the Russian war, and Tony Dick says, I think different rules apply in a war. Right, he's suggesting a point that I made about the special military operation. For instance, Ukraine in a war would be without electricity during a war, and all the railways in and out of Ukraine would not be running in a war. Grain ships would not be leaving Odessa in a war. The Ukraine parliament would be a pile of rubble in a war. Ukrainian political leaders may well have been directly targeted in a war. Well, I'm not entirely sure that is correct, and I think your understanding of a war is very specific. The comment really comes very close to a sort of repetition of the Russian propaganda. 3 years into Putin's so-called special military operation, the Kremlin clings to this narrative that it's not engaged in a war, and yet it's got a wartime economy. The narrative is so threadbare that even its architects appear ashamed to call it what it actually is. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to mount a remarkable and increasingly high-tech resistance. Today, if we examine the human cost, the economic collapse, the psychological toll, now visible on both sides of the front line, you can't run around and say, oh, this is not a war. Russia has now lost close to 1 million troops in Ukraine. Not a war. A staggering number that exposes the fantasy of quick victory. According to Ukraine's General Staff, 978,700 Russian military personnel have been killed, wounded, or otherwise rendered unfit for combat, and yet the system persists. In one of the grimmest illustrations of despair, there's a 35-year-old soldier, Pavel Stovchan, a wounded contract soldier who attempted suicide on camera in a desperate effort to be released from service. His father was already dead, killed on the front, and Stovchan begged to leave, and the military responded not with compassion but with criminal charges. It's perhaps the most macabre confirmation that this is not merely a military campaign, but a human meat grinder in the service of delusion, conducted from the confines of a Smeg fridge. The linguistic sleight of hand that this is a special military operation and not a war, for Putin, the term special military operation, it's not simply a euphemism, it's a legal fiction. Under Russian law, a war would necessitate formal mobilization, wider conscription powers, and a declaration triggering international legal consequences. Operation allows him plausible deniability, domestic censorship, and the pretense of control. Internationally, of course, this is a war by any reasonable metric. It involves territorial aggression from Russia, annexation attempts from Russia, mass mobilization of Russia, state-directed military campaigns from Russia, and the Geneva Conventions apply, even if Russia ignores them. The Kremlin's refusal to name it as a war is both a legal dodge and a propaganda crutch. And you look across at Putin, at all these elites limping around with their propaganda crutches, despite exhaustion and loss. Ukraine's resistance to this war is evolving. In April alone, Ukrainian drones destroyed 83,000 Russian targets in a war, an 8% rise from the previous month. These include oil refineries, military depots, logistical arteries deep inside Russian territory that are used to attack Ukraine from Russian territory. Commander Syrskyi calls it active defense. I would call it defiant modernity. Moreover, Ukraine took 115 positions in April, tactical gains that belie Russian proclamations of inevitable success. Russia isn't winning this war. The war machine runs on cash, and Russia is running out of cash. It can't continue this war. Oil prices have collapsed below $50 a barrel, a full 40% below the Kremlin's budget forecast. Revenues from oil and gas during this war, which form nearly 30% of Russia's early 2025 budget, have tumbled. The response? Budget slashing. Moscow has gutted its plans for aviation, robotics, shipping and car innovation. Even high-tech civilian production, once touted as Russia's route to post-sanctions independence, is being sacrificed in this war. To quote pro-Kremlin Kommersant, there's no margin left. Russia is feeding its military furnace with the ashes of its civilian future. The diplomatic theatre continues. Vice President J.D. Vance now insists that the US is working to bring Ukraine and Russia together within 100 days. Great! At the Vatican. The initial bluster of Trump's promise to end this war in one day has softened, particularly under pressure from Macron and Starmer to redirect his criticism towards Moscow. Indeed, it now appears Trump has accepted what Ukraine and most of Europe have known for years. Putin is not interested in peace because he still believes he can win. And now that's defined by Lavrov. But after 3 years, that belief surely withers in credibility. Russia cannot pay for this war. It cannot explain this war. And increasingly, it cannot staff this war, not without coercion, not without cruelty, and certainly not without collapse. All we may hear from Russia is how much Russia supports this war. But that is because Russia is a dictatorship that controls its people with censorship. We don't hear what ordinary people are saying against the war. We only hear that if we talk to them. I do. I listen. Ukraine is betting on resilience, on innovation and international solidarity. Russia is betting on exhaustion, hoping that the West's attrition will drift, that time will work in its favour. But time is not neutral. Ukraine's drone tactics, battlefield maneuvers, moral clarity are steadily changing the strategic balance, and Russia's shrinking economy, suicidal soldiers, fictional terminology are signs of a state trapped in its own illusions, and it's time that state woke up. In 2022, Russia invaded a neighbour under the guise of a special military operation. In 2025, it continues a war that now looks increasingly like an act of self-harm. If Russia wants to recover, it needs to stop this stupid war. And the people who are encouraging it, like Tony Dick and others, need to grow up. And they can start growing up by starting to use real names rather than these stupid nom de guerre. As Ukrainian drones fly by, Russian budgets burn, and even wounded soldiers are denied release, it becomes harder to sustain the Kremlin's illusion. This isn't a special military operation. This is not a victory. This is desperation, televised, and my heart bleeds for the real Russian people. This is not a victory. And this is not an inevitable victory. And this is a war. This is a war, and a grotesque and awful war, and people are dying. This is not some special military operation.